Hello everyone, today I'm going to be talking about pre-fader and post-fader. Now it seems that the distinction and the implementation of the two has originated in analog mixers. I'm going to be demonstrating on this guy here. This is an old Yamaha 1602, it's an MQ 1602 mixer. I think it's like from the 1980s or something. So basically I'll just demonstrate what goes on here. So there's three mixes, or three, three buses that are going on. The first one is your main output bus, which is these guys here. It's called a program. Your second one is it's called a foldback, which is this guy here. And this is called also a Q mix or a monitor mix, whatever you want to call it. And the third one is the effects bus, which in this case, this board, they call it the echo bus. Now, let's start with the program. So your main output signal, or your main output bus, what goes on is your input source has either a line input or a mic input, which you select here. Gets amplified by a certain amount by your input level selector here, runs through the EQ, runs through the fader, is adjusted, its level is adjusted by the fader, and then gets panned by the pan knob, and then gets sent to the final program bus. All of these channels get summed down to this final program bus, which you then select your level with a left and right fader. Your foldback or monitor mix is what it's called. What happens is your input source is either a mic or a line, gets affected by your input level, it bypasses the EQ, it bypasses the fader, and it bypasses the pan and goes directly to the foldback. And for each channel you can set their levels individually by these individual knobs, and the overall level of all of these knobs, these monitor sends or foldback sends, is then affected by the foldback or monitor fader here on the foldback bus. So this is the final output level. Each channel has its own individual knob where you can set an individual level. Now for the effects send or the effects bus, your level or your input source comes through the line or mic, is affected by the level source, runs through the EQ, then it runs through the fader and the level is changed by the fader, bypasses the pan, and then goes to the echo knobs or the effects send knobs here. And each channel you can adjust individually and separately, and all of these effects sends get summed down to this here effects bus fader, and the final output signal level of that effects bus is affected by this fader. So basically what's going on is the effects send here. This thing is post EQ and post fader, and it bypasses the pan because it's just a mono signal. The foldback or the monitor mix, it bypasses the EQ and bypasses the fader and bypasses the pan. So this is technically called pre-EQ and pre-fader, and basically has no pan because it is a mono source as well. I'm using Cubase, but pretty much any DAW will allow you to switch between pre-fader and post-fader. And some of them might allow you to do or switch between pre-EQ and post-EQ, or some other kind of thing like that. Now I'm going to be showing what's going on in Cubase. So if you open up your operation manual and go to page 375, then you can see this this signal path diagram. So the audio signal runs through first the input gain, then runs through the first 6 insert slots, then through the EQ, and then through the fader, and then through the last 2 insert slots. So by definition, insert slots 1 through 6 are pre-fader, and 7 and 8 are post-fader. So in the mixer window, you can see the configuration. There's this pre-section, so all of this stuff affects the signal first, then runs through the first 6 insert slots, then runs through the EQ, then runs through the fader, and then runs through the last 2 insert slots. Alright, so now that we've described what pre-fader is and what post-fader is, you might ask why you would use one over the other. Now, I have 4 plugins here that I'll kind of just demonstrate. 3 of them are good examples of why you would use pre-fader. One of them is why you would use post-fader. The first pre-fader plugin is compression. Any kind of compression always works off of a threshold. Either you can set the threshold amount, like in this plugin, you can set what the threshold is, or you have a fixed threshold and then you change the input level of that input source into the threshold of the compressor. So this here, I have a snare, and if we play it, this is in a pre-fader position. If I play this snare, you can see how much gain reduction there is. There's about 2 decibels of gain reduction. If I was to move this in a post-fader position, whenever the fader is at 0, it will process the same amount. It still has about 2 decibels of gain reduction. But if I were to change it like -10, it's not going to get almost any compression at all because it's not even reaching the threshold anymore. So essentially the fader now becomes a kind of input source on the actual plugin itself. Let's move that back to pre-fader and this back to normal. Now if I move this up and down, we could see more or less compression going on. So compression, very important to know. It is affected by a threshold, and you would probably most likely want it to be in pre-fader position, because let's say you had automation or you're just changing your mix around because you feel, oh, the snare's too loud, put it down. In the pre-fader position, your compression is going to stay the same. So that's important to know. Another plugin that's very similar in the way it's affected is an EQ plugin like this, which is Shep's 73 plugin. There's a drive amount, or even just the preamp without the drive. Either way, this has an input threshold, and the drive amount or the preamp amount is going to be affected by the actual signal that's running through the plugin. So if we crank this here and we have this on the input, we could see there's something going on. If we crank it even more, so it's closer to 0, we're starting to get a lot more of that like harmonic distortion stuff. And let's actually link these. So when we turn the input down, we're getting less saturation. The more we turn the input up, the more saturation we get. So in this plugin, likewise, the input source matters in the way that the plugin is processing. So having that on pre-fader and post-fader will be different, either or. So choose whatever you want wisely. Lastly, something like this plugin here, which is a tape saturation, very much like that EQ, that Shep's EQ plugin, is the input source affects the way the plugin processes the sound. It's a lot more input, has a lot more tape saturation, and a lot less has a lot less saturation, etc., etc. So those are plugins that I would use in pre-fader in almost all cases, unless I was to like somehow automate the saturation amount or something, or the compression amount. But at that point I would still just keep it in pre-fader and automate the actual inputs on the plugins rather than by using the fader. So one plugin that I would actually use on post fader is a limiter plugin. So either on my mix bus or on my individual channels, either way. If it's in the post fader position, the limiter plugin is the designator of what is the final limit of an output signal. If I put it into the pre-fader position, it no longer is the designator of the limit of a final output signal, because the signal runs through the limiter and then runs through the fader. So at this point here with it in pre-fader, the whole signal in the mix bus is running through this, will never reach further than what I've designated here, 0.02, 0.023 decibels, minus 0.023 decibels. It'll never reach past this amount, but it then runs through the fader, and then I can put it even higher than that or lower than that. And if I put it higher than that, it's now going to clip in this mix bus, and I don't want that. If I had it on the post fader position, then it doesn't matter that it's over 0, because it runs through the fader and then runs through the limiter plugin, and then will never reach above minus 0.23. So I'll just quickly demonstrate. So never reaching minus 0.2 dB, because that's what I defined it to be. In the pre-fader position, clipping by about 4 decibels, and that's how much more I put it, how much more the fader is than it is from 0. Now we're going to talk about effect sends in Cubase. So in Cubase, every track has 8 available effect sends, and each one of them can be switched from pre-fader to post fader, each one of these individually. Now if you open up your operation manual and go to page 386, we can see this diagram here, very similar to the last one we saw. The signal runs through the input gain, then through the insert effects 1 through 6, then through the EQ, and this is where the pre-fader send is. So with the pre-fader send, you're bypassing the volume fader and the inserts 7 and 8. And the post-fader is post-fader and post-insert 7 and 8. So that's kind of an interesting thing. You can configure things in a certain way to bypass both the fader and the inserts 7 and 8. You can't really do much for an effect send to be pre-EQ or anything, at least not that I know of. Maybe there's something more in here, but either way, I'll demonstrate why you would want to use pre-fader and why you'd want to use post-fader for this. So let's take an example with the snare. We have, oh boy, 3 kinds of reverbs here. So let's without any reverbs, quite dry. With the reverbs nice and wet, very reverb-like sound. Now these are all, what are these on? I think these are pre-fader. Let's open up the mixer. Move to pre-fader. Okay, so these are all post-fader. So right now, if I was to change the fader amount, the reverb amount that you hear is proportional to the snare level. So if I turn it up and down, the reverb is also being turned up and down proportionately. If I was to change all of these to pre-fader, I now have individual control of just the dry signal of the snare. This can be actually pretty handy if you're doing some sort of automation and want to have like a nice reverb effect where you have you just cut out the dry signal completely. One thing that this does, like just in kind of theory wise, is the less dry signal you have, the further away it sounds. So let's say for example, if you want to do a vocal and you want to make that vocal seem to like move further and further away, like progressively further back, one way of doing that is to automate, let's say, the reverb and have it turn up and automate the volume of the vocal down and kind of like do this cool like intricate kind of thing. Or the other way is to have the reverb on pre-fader, and then all you have to do is move the fader up and down, and that's how you get the effect. So that's one reason why you'd want to use pre-fader. Post-fader is the previous example that I talked about, is if you want the effects to change relative and proportional to the amount that you're changing the volume of the channel, then have it in post-fader. Okay, and the third thing we're going to talk about is the Q sends. So in Cubase, the amount of Q sends that you have available to you is dependent on what you set up in your studio settings in the VST sections, VST connections sections. So here I have 2 Q mixes set up, therefore 2 Q mixes show up on each of the channels. And each of these Qs can be set to pre-fader or post-fader, just like your FX sends can be switched between pre and post. And then you have your level amount. And this one, let's go to the operation manual, page 118. And here's your not equalizer. Here we go, Q send stuff. So this is in Cubase Pro only. I think all the lesser versions don't have it. They don't actually have any Q sends. But anyways, so very similar to the FX sends here. And lastly, one thing that I sort of forgot and just remembered is in each of your channels in Cubase here, you open it up, you have your sends here, you have your insert section here, you have your equalizer here, and you have your sort of channel strip stuff here. Now if you go into this little tab here, this is where your EQ is being processed. So it's after the gate compressor in the channel strip and before the tools, saturation, and limiting in the channel strip. You can move that however you want within the ordering of the channel strip. And on top of that, you can change the ordering of your inserts from your channel strip. So you can have the inserts before the channel strip or after the channel strip. So in this sense, you can have your EQ, which is in the strip region. So you can have your EQ happen before your inserts here, or you can switch it so that your inserts are before your EQ in the channel strip. So that's one other sort of pre-post thing to think about. Cool, yeah, so hopefully I covered everything. There might be other ways that you can use pre and post fader to your advantage for any kind of mixing situation, but I think I've covered most of the bases of what you would ever want to do in any mix. And yeah, so hopefully you guys like that. I know some people were asking about pre-fader and post-fader, and I had to do some research myself to figure out things before making this video. So hopefully we're all caught up to speed and we know a little bit more about that stuff, and hopefully you like that. Leave a like if you did. Hit the subscribe button too if you like these kinds of videos, because this is kind of what my channel is about, is these kinds of videos. I do other types of videos, but this is the core of it. It's usually Cubase related. If not, then just general theory related that I want to speak to in on a number of different topics. So anyways, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.